Hi, this is Aaron Azrod, and welcome to the 103rd episode of the Truth Island podcast. Throughout the ages, people have looked towards archetypes or role models to influence their behavior. Take the ancient Greeks, who had an array of gods which they believed personified every gamut of human emotions and ambition. For example, one might want to base their behavior on that of Aphrodite if they wish to court a partner and fall in love, but take a page out of the book of Ares if they were on the cusp of war. While in more modern times we might think of Greek mythology as being simply fun stories to enjoy, these tales in many respects came to embody the values that the Greeks came to cherish. The practice of creating supreme embodiments of human goodness and wickedness encompasses virtually every culture and time period known to man, with stories of prophets dominating the Abrahamic religions in the West, and Siddhartha Gautama and Brahma serving as examples in the East. While science has certainly enhanced our understanding of the world and filled in many of the gaps once occupied by superstition and belief, having archetypes or role models still remains a huge part of our culture. Whether we realize it or not, we are on a daily basis being influenced by sports athletes, celebrities, business tycoons, and other media types. Yet, a very important question arises. Are these role models necessarily the people that we should be following? Much like our ancient ancestors, those who we worship can on one hand embody the very best of what humanity has to offer, but on the other, it never hurts to pause and reflect on whether or not the images we are being inundated with represent the values that we as a society should emulate. Indeed, as discussed on previous episodes of this podcast, there remains a huge decline of good and virtuous characters that are currently being championed, with ruthless anti-heroes becoming a more domineering presence in our media culture. Today, I am joined by Jim, who's here to help me uncover what influence these role models might still have on us and how we might start looking for better candidates to lionize and worship. Jim, let me start off by asking you, who is someone you look up to?
So I have several role models. One of them is Jocko Willink with Extreme Ownership and Echelon Front. Then, of course, I have Christ, Jesus Christ in the biblical narrative, Plato, Lincoln, Alexander the Great. And this is going to sound the really nerdy part of me, is Gandalf and Aragorn of all things. Um, I really like how Tolkien makes his characters, and they're almost lifelike in many regards. Great role models, I think.
Yeah, sometimes we can look up to fictional role models. I think that's totally cool. It's okay if Luke Skywalker is making your life better, then so be it, my friend, right?
Absolutely. No, but I mean, I'm sure we'll get into that here in a little bit, because they are role models that are in culture, both
Abs-
real and fictional. So
Yeah, absolutely. And, a lot of people don't even realize that a lot of fictional characters are based on mythology or based on, religious idealisms from other cultures. A lot of people think that like someone like George Lucas just came up with this idea of light and darkness. And I'm like, no, 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 no. He's reaching back to Zoroastrianism to figure that one out. So whether we want to admit it or we're aware or unaware, we have a lot of these archetype figures that are actually really harkening back to ancient history.
absolutely, it's in so many different ways too. I thought it was interesting how you brought up, the Greek gods and stuff, and so the Greek gods are pretty interesting in a lot of ways because they in some ways they stratify their gods both within hierarchy within gods and also the demigods, creatures, and so on and so forth that represent different aspects. The Greeks oftentimes tried on the societal level, like that's where you see like Zeus like governing, right? But also with good government comes betrayal, or the betrayal of government, that's like an archetypal Zeus type of thing. Aphrodite, yes, you could follow Aphrodite to learn how to love better, but you better be careful because Aphrodite also represents this dichotomous relationship with lust, which actually caused her to destroy a relationship with Hephaestus, which is like the blacksmith of the Greek gods. Yeah, and Ares is, he's the goddess of war, god of war, and the god of cowardice.
Very interesting. So it seems like all of these Greek gods stood, they were emblems for certain things, but they also had flaws, right? Like Zeus constantly cheated, constantly went down to earth as a mortal and had affairs and so forth. Do the Greeks kind of highlight these flaws as things to avoid? Like, hey, even Zeus makes a mistake here and there, or did they celebrate those flaws?
That's actually an interesting question, and I would probably say that it's more of a warning. The issue, though, is how you integrate those negative, what we would perceive as negative aspects of personality or something like that. Like, I mean, like we could talk about the masculine and the feminine, order, chaos. I mean, all these things are kind of the same way and can be looked at that same in that way.
Yeah, I hear you because I would imagine like is there like for example with Ares, he's also the god of cowardice. Is there like a story where his cowardice kind of like comes and bites him on the behind?
My mind goes to the Odyssey, where
Mm.
it's alluded to during the Odyssey or the Iliad. It's like this cowardice of it's associated with resentment. It kind of comes out, and he flees battle versus attacking. There's also, I mean, there's multiple these personalities are multifaceted, and you can kind of generalize looking at the basic dichotomy. But even then, like you can take love, the highest virtue in many regards, to the worst place, for example. So Aphrodite, she loved, and Adonis was like the statue of David as far as like levels of beauty is concerned. And she was obsessed over it too. So there's this balancing act that has to occur when you look at these different types of emotions or these different types of modes of being.
You see, it always like for me personally, it's always comforted that these gods have this human element to them. And I also find comfort that the Abrahamic prophets also have flaws and they also have things. Like I think of Jonah like kind of running away from responsibility. And I think that if the archetypes were perfect in everything, then we really wouldn't emulate them as much. I actually think that their greatest selling point is their flaws or the things that they overcome within themselves. I think that's what makes them relatable. And I think it's not just the virtues that they embody, but how they kind of improve to become even more virtuous through like some misfortune or some bad choice that they've made. Like I know that Odysseus makes 1,001 bad choices, right? Don't open Pandora's box or so, like 1,000 choices he makes wrong, but it's kind of his overcoming those bad choices that really teaches us a lesson.
So Odysseus is actually an interesting story because his is a generational type of thing. So the myth of Sisyphus, right, where the guy who's punished for like pushing a hill, like a rock up a hill over and over and over again, that was like his great 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 whatever grandfather, and he was known as like the ultimate trickster. Then you have this story of Odysseus that comes around. He's like a good trickster in ways. Yes, he's a trickster, but like he is able to use it to to defeat the Trojans or get off the island with the Cyclops saying I'm nobody.
Yeah.
So it's actually interesting because like there's different things and I mean I think that's just good storytelling 101. Like you have to have a really interesting limitation, and it's funny also you point out Odysseus because I think there's one character in most of the mythologies and religions out there that doesn't have a flaw, and that is Christ.
Mm-hmm.
I'm biased because I'm a Christian, but like that's what I would say. It's almost like a generational type thing too, because God sends His Son to rid the world or to help conquer death. I won't say rid the world of sin, but give somebody a method of saving themselves through this perfect figure, which is interesting because that's probably the one character everyone keeps coming back to, at least for right now. So the Greeks in most mythologies that break down like their gods and goddesses by, let's call it, natural functions in the world, don't do I don't think they do a job like Christ can do in the Bible. And the reason why is because they're pointing at too many different places. even if you have, Zeus overall, you still have like Artemis and all the other ones that you can be worshipped and not, and like this is the one that's worth it. And
Hmm.
that's the problem. And in that regard, where Christ, everything points to God because like Jesus is God and you have the Holy Spirit. And so you have this Trinity, not separate. They're separate, but they're also the same. And I know it's an oxymoron in some of its own regards or a paradox, but they're also the same. And so it all points to this highest value of truth.
I see. So just to summarize what you're saying, like the Greeks look to their gods as being like, here's some stuff that is really awesome, but here's some flaws that I should kind of avoid. Like because these are imperfect, deities, then we can both emulate what we like about them, and we can also learn from their mistakes. Whereas with Jesus, it's more of like, this is the life that we should be kind of
Yeah.
following.
This is the highest mode of like the highest mode of being, the highest truth. And you can put it that way as far as the Greeks are concerned.
I'm sure that has, evolved. And I think that like the Buddhists have that kind of relationship with Buddha. Like if Buddha
Mhm.
did it, then it's pretty rock solid that that's what you ought to be doing. When we think of these, of these figures, they tend to influence greatly the society that they're enmeshed with, right? And I think that this is even true in Africa. They have a lot of oral traditions, and in the Americas they also have, like, even other non-Western cultures kind of have these figures, and sort of look to them for guidance.
Overall, like every society is going to have this overall like value that they see, and their myths kind of revolve around that a little bit. The oceanic tradition, so like if we've all seen Moana, that's oceanic. Maui, he represents the trickster god, but is also lifting islands to create new places to voyage and to explore and stuff like that. And Moana gets a lot of things right as far as some of its religion. Of course, it's a little bit more bloody than that. One of the things I find interesting about Native American traditions is we tend to not like snakes in most places around the world, right?
Us and Indiana Jones, we don't we
Yes, absolutely. He would have a fit, but there's a story of a young Native American girl. But the idea is, she marries a rattlesnake, and she tries to say, hey, the snake is fine. Don't mess with the snake. Live with the snake, and that's a very common theme in in these more oral type of cultures.
So that's kind of like, and I think that speaks to the values of that culture. So that culture is kind of saying, yeah, don't hunt all of these animals. Yeah, don't, destroy the land and fill it with concrete and cement. Like, we have to kind of just live within nature. And, I'm not even placing like any value judgments on any of these things. We're just
Mhm.
pointing out the connection between
Absolutely.
the gods, and we're pointing out the connection between what you believe in and how that influences our culture. Now, obviously we've, moving into the modern era, we had, for the very longest time, I think Christianity was the chief, the chief archetype of how human behavior should
Mhm.
come. Like, they produced, with Jesus as being the prime role model, they kind of serve that. As we move into, the late 19th century, we have the writings of Nietzsche, and we start moving away from Christianity. Do you think that as we've moved away from Christianity, we've like lost touch with archetypes, or do you think that they're still kind of swimming around in our culture today?
So they're definitely swimming around in our culture. The thing is, we may not recognize them immediately, or we discount them because we want to focus on more of like the is. And there's nothing wrong with science and exploring the natural world and stuff like that. But there's still a truth to these stories that transcends both. I think transcends in some ways the science, or a science perspective in many ways.
At some point in the 20th century, we decided, hey, we don't need role models. We don't need archetypes. We've got science. And science, I love science, man. It's making this Zoom phone call possible right now.
Absolutely.
But there's no role models in science. And I think that is something that we're kind of missing here, is that when we look at science, we can look at like, all right, what should I do to survive? We can look at the world through that lens, but that might actually lead us to some very dark conclusions. Whereas, and one of the things that I always want to ask a scientist is like, what do how would you define a good life, or what would you define courage looks like? And I don't think these are questions that I don't think science is capable of answering. I don't think science is capable of answering the question of like, do these things, and that is fulfilling the virtue of courage. And I think that is something that we kind of look towards our media and sort of other vehicles or other outlets to kind of feel fulfilled with.
Yes, in some ways, in great words of a good old Nietzsche, it's God is dead and we killed him, in that regard, and where morals come from, the tree of morals and stuff like that. So that's a very interesting take. And in today, I think Carl Jung kind of talks about it in Undiscovered Self, is this the clash of the Christian symbols is kind of becoming almost out of date. And so, or he has to respond to a new challenge, which it's been responding to challenges for 2,000 years. So the question is, can it survive the next round? We don't know. Neil Gaiman's book, American Gods, it kind of tackles this a lot. It's just a TV show on Stars now. Pretty excited for season 3 on the 10th. So mark your calendars. But the idea here is the new versus the old gods, and like one of the new gods is technology and media, and the old gods are like Wednesday and Odin. That is Odin. But like what do these gods? There's a great conversation and like what people believe, and you believe that this plane flies because of science? Okay.
Here's the thing. I don't subscribe to the theory that science and religion are at war with one another. I think they work very nicely in tandem with one another. Where I think that we're missing is that we need exemplars of behavior to kind of shape us. And I think that's where, and you can use statistics to say, well, studies show that people who do this are happier and so forth, but that doesn't necessarily apply. That applies only to the aggregate. It doesn't necessarily apply to the individual, and that level of happiness also fluctuates from culture to culture and the values of a society. Like most people, for example, it's a little misleading with science, is that most people are happy when they feel accepted into their society. And where you kind of need archetypes and where you kind of need role models, that's kind of influencing whether your behavior is either inbound or out of bounds, right? And if your behavior is out of bounds, then you're going to be kind of removed from society, and maybe rightfully so. Maybe you're engaging in some behavior that's not quite acceptable, and that's okay. So I think that science doesn't really do a good job of explaining like what behaviors are okay or acceptable and what behaviors are not acceptable.
I would agree with you there, in a way that it deals with the individuation process. And what does it mean to be an individual? Because what I would kind of push back on is the pursuit of meaning is probably I don't know why we put the pursuit of happiness, right? That's in the Declaration of Independence. It's fine, but it should probably sound something like the pursuit of meaning, because happiness is it's a terrible term, to be honest with you. But meaning, a man with a why can conquer anything. I mean,
Yes.
that's just what it is. And so how do you create meaning, and how can you create meaning through imitating and studying role models, for example? I mean, what role models are coming up in the society even today. I mean, like, let's look at superhero movies 50 years ago versus or not movies, but superheroes 50 years ago versus superheroes now. We've got I think a great dichotomy between DC and Marvel. Like Marvel, funny, entertaining, somewhat light, but can carry some serious undertones and not take itself too seriously. DC, too gritty. It's got to be very gritty, and it's got to be super serious. When in reality, it's a superhero. I mean, it's an archetype. So
that's interesting. I think we should because I think that superheroes do reflect the values. And I've had this discussion before that maybe our superheroes of the 40s and 50s were just a little too, milk and cookies, a little too clean cut for us to really believe in them. And so we might actually even be borrowing from the Greeks in some way, where we're kind of giving them some more jagged edges, more flaws, or things that they need to personally overcome. What I'm starting to look at, though, is, it's okay if the superhero over the trilogy or over the film experiences growth. I think that's awesome. And I think that kind of teaches us to kind of grapple with ourselves. And that's okay to have, like, superheroes that are flawed. What I am more wary of is sort of the anti-hero. I think of like a Tony Soprano or some of these other kind of figures that their means are pretty screwed up and their ends are pretty screwed up. Like their ends are just like, well, now Tony Soprano is not a superhero, but he is a protagonist. Like he is a protagonist. And we also can think of, again, great television show, Breaking Bad. I mean, really, like, really well written, excellent. But when you finish watching it, and now that it's been a few years since the show's been off the air, I do scratch my chin and been like, well, why exactly are we rooting for Walter White? Why are we rooting for somebody who doesn't really have either good means or good ends? His ends is to become some kind of gangster drug cartel kingpin. And I'm like, why are we rooting for this guy?
That's a question I probably couldn't really begin to answer. And for me, I'm familiar with Breaking Bad. I haven't actually watched it, but for me, the Joker was like one of those that really hit home. The Joker movie, you end up cheering for him because he was bullied and he was like he was beating up, like, and now he kind of starts going down this line where he's like, vengeance is kind of key there. It to me that just kind of takes me back to this, to like honor and prestige aspects of Norse mythology in some regards, which we both know is really dark, because they lived in a dark place, right? Then we also have things like the Grimm fairy tales,
Yes.
extremely dark, and to a point, so like, our stories do reflect, as we kind of keep bringing up this theme, like kind of where we are in time and space of like in our relationships with each other, the collective unconscious, or something like that, the collective shadow. um Vampires were the Victorian age, so all of these different stories that came out of the Victorian age, vampires, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, some of these other things are actually the shadow of the Victorian age.
That's very interesting. And it kind of brings about a chicken or egg kind of situation where I'm like, is Dracula influencing bad behavior, or did bad behavior influence Dracula? So we were always asking ourselves this question of like, I'm kind of optimistic on this, is that I think that what we tend to idolize tends to influence behavior. So maybe I'm saying that the chicken comes first, or I'm not sure how it pairs up, but I'm thinking that, like, if I idolize somebody who's pretty nefarious but really wealthy and powerful, well, then that's going to start influencing my behavior. So I think that that's fundamentally a good thing, because we kind of have control over it. If we start making more movies, and we start coming up with more role models that kind of embody better as to who we want to be, well, then maybe we can start changing behavior.
Well, there's a few different things there that I would kind of start to kind of pose, I think.
Yeah, sure.
So what is the appropriate story, or in some cases models that you can act out in like a video game, for example? So if I play Halo, like I'm a walking, killing machine, which there's some merit to that. If
Uh-huh.
I play Grand Theft Auto, I'm a criminal.
Yeah.
But I'm actively exploring this side of me, this anarchical criminal underworld type of thing, our outlaw perspective. in a controlled environment. But the problem is even when I do it there, I can pull some of that behavior out into the real world.
Yes, and this is actually, I want to actually really put our thumbs strongly down here, and I think we can talk a lot about a game such as Grand Theft Auto. And again, I am guilty of playing these games myself when I was a teenager.
They're still great games.
I'm not pretending that I am like, excuse me, I was reading Victorian literature while you guys were playing Grand. No, no, no. Okay, I was definitely rolling around in the mud just like anyone else. But when I look back at my teenage years and I did spend copious amounts of hours playing these games, what exactly was I emulating? I was emulating the game was providing a virtual simulation where you are a criminal, you are, blowing things up, you are attacking innocent people, all in the pursuit of, like in the game, like in this game Vice City, for example, the ultimate goal is to live in this huge mansion, right? Kind of like in a Scarface like mansion. I'm like, what's like, are these really values and virtues that are going to help you in the world? Are these virtues helping humanity grow and so forth? And for the longest time, we said to ourselves, come on, it's just entertainment, it's just a mild distraction. But now that this generation is coming of age, we're actually starting to see that a lot of people my age have not shaken their boots off of the mud, and they're still kind of like heavily influenced by a lot, like a lot of this simulation and a lot of these games, and they're actually looking to them as pseudo. I'm not saying it turns young men into violent criminals, but it kind of does work some magic in the back of their psyche.
Well, it changes what they find meaningful,
Hmm.
for one. And this is one reason why I don't play video games as often anymore, is because for me, I can play a video game for 10 hours, but at the end of the day, I feel like I've accomplished nothing.
Yes, yeah.
So people oftentimes like to like this is where they find some form of meaning, right? For a kid, a teenager or something like that, like I don't particularly see an issue with that. I think you have to explore it out. But the question is, and of course, as a expecting father, the question I have to ask myself is, at what point do I need to pull my kid away from the game and say the game is only going to get you so far?
Yeah.
Yes, you could be the best Halo player in the world and go do esports, and that's fine. Like, good for you. But at the end of the day, what are you really doing with your life? How are you contributing? And but then again, those like esports people, they're an exception to the rule. I mean, a very large except or a very big exception to the rule.
Well, let me first start off by congratulating on you on being a father soon to be. And
Oh,
these are really important questions. My first video game was Nintendo playing Super Mario Brothers, and Super Mario was not an archetype. He was a bunch of pixels that jumped and ran, and it was like there was no like virtue or story behind it. So it was, I would say, it was a little bit more benign and a bit more harmless. And the same
yeah.
thing with Pong or any of these really early games is that, but now these games have really rich stories. They have these very rich stories, and the protagonist is just usually a brutal killer or is typically not necessarily the best person. And we got to pause and think to ourselves, like, these values are transmitting
Mhm.
to the next generation. And it could be the worst thing that they could transmit is that maybe it's not the worst case scenario where children are becoming brutal killers or something like that, but I think it makes you a lot more apathetic to human suffering. That's what I've noticed a lot from my generation and younger. I mean, I taught for 10 years high school, and I noticed that the youth of today are becoming increasingly more apathetic to human suffering. Like, you'll read a book or you'll read something from history where it was like, and then, a million people were gassed or, executed, and they're like, so what? And that's the danger here, is that these archetypical figures or these role models that they're following them are really teaching them to not be emotional and to be extremely callous in how they evaluate human life. And I think a first person shooter does that remarkably. It really teaches you that human life is of no consequence whatsoever. And I think we would be remiss to just ignore that.
I think we'd also be remiss to ignore the positives of it too. It teaches you teamwork in a way that, aiming at a common goal. just to kind of play devil's advocate for a minute or two, like video games, and for the most part, where you see one perspective of bad or good, there's always the opposite perspective, depending on how it's used. I mean, I think most people spend a lot of time playing Skyrim, especially from our generation. I mean that game, like you can get sucked up in and never do the main storyline, and you can be both good and bad. You can make decisions, and it gives you a space to make those decisions. The problem is, do you recognize that it's real, that it's not real,
Hmm. Hmm.
and how do you reconcile the experience that you get in a game and that you literally are like experiencing with your role model as both yourself and like this potential that you could be, like how do you reconcile that with their true the maybe your true self in the real world and aim at a higher mode of being.
So I think that all of these things could be softened, okay, or tempered, is if we had real role models out in the larger world that were kind of keeping these virtual role models in check. So again,
Yeah.
it could be having just a good father figure in your life. That's a role model right there. Because if you're playing a video game and you have a father who works 10 hours a day and teaches you how to throw a baseball and is really there for you, that archetype of a caring father is now usurping the archetype of some first person shooter guy, right? Because like that's especially when we're entering like the male psyche, is that that's really important to have role models. And if there are no good father figures out there, well then the kid playing video game is going to emulate whatever media icon is being thrown in his lap. And I think also we could do a better job of having more role models from history or from contemporary culture that are doing really, really incredible work. I was just having a conversation on my last podcast about like paramedics, firefighters, all of these great figures that we have that every single day they're doing the opposite of a first person shooter. They're actually risking their lives to save other lives, not destroy lives and so forth. And I'm like, how do we kind of, I think that's a good check and that's a good balance on some of this stuff.
I mean, or even realizing that your KD ratio in Call of Duty doesn't translate to how effective you're going to be on a battlefield in the real world. I mean, I think that's a big starting point right there, because when you die, you die. You don't get a respawn.
Yeah, right.
And so it is a terrible secret, unfortunately, to quote someone I know. One of my role models is Major General Eric Carilla. He he is currently the 18th Airborne Corps commander. It's a 3-star general here at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Was the 82nd Airborne's commanding general, and so I mean, the great generation, those men and women, like those they served as role models for a while,
Yes.
and we can definitely see some of the benefits that occurred from that. But also, things start to decay if left unchecked, or if canceled too much or something like that too. President Lincoln, also one of my role models, was recently canceled or something like that because, or his statue was attacked and torn down because he sanctioned something to do with the South Dakota tribe, or a South Dakota Native American tribe. Well, I'm not saying it's not a bad thing, but it just should be taken into account that, hey, people make mistakes, especially humans, and it doesn't discount all the things that he has done. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
hands down, one of the best presidents that this nation's ever seen and probably ever will see.
So yeah, no, I think thinking about Lincoln, thinking about our World War II generals and so forth, I think reassessing what valor looks like is really, really helpful, because I think that again, I can't really comment too much on this, but I think a
Yeah.
part of that is sacrifice, and I think a part of that is the good that you like you were in a rocky situation, and what good did you bring in that
Mhm.
situation? And I think that's kind of what we could be highlighting a lot more in our current role models.
That and how they overcome the technology as well. Because in particular, I guess this is one of my things, is we have a lot of keyboard warriors out there. who I would equate them to, as I said, I'm a fan of Aragorn, right? So like Aragorn before the Black Gates and the Return of the King gives a speech. It's portrayed pretty well in the movie. And it's something to the effect of like, I look into your eyes and I see the courage that would take like the life of me, or something like that, to that effect, right? Having courage in the real world is a lot different than having courage behind a keyboard.
Yeah.
Uh, and so like, how do you overcome that? And like, how do our influencers actually overcome that versus just being an influencer behind a keyboard? That's a very hard thing, I think, to figure out, and how we can move from that archetype to other archetypes that people are acting out in the world.
I think that's something really profound that you're touching upon here, because I think that like a keyboard influencer is playing a very low stakes game. They don't really have all that much to lose. And even their avatars in whatever game that they're simulating, it's just as you said a few minutes ago, your character dies within 5 minutes, they'll be respawned and everything will be a-okay. And I think that right there is not necessarily heroic, because the stakes aren't real. So I think when we're looking at archetypes, we want to be studying role models who risked a lot when the stakes were really real.
Yeah, but what is real? I know that like, this is a weird question, but we just kind of glanced over how people don't empathize well anymore, or something like that, and so like they're trying to find this void to empathy, under the guise of calling it that, but it's not. How do people overcome this? How can we find the right role models that they can be anti-heroes in some regards? Like right now, I think we need stories of people who are overcoming this societal keyboard influencer video, like, I mean, things behind a computer versus things in front, like in the real world.
So I'll give you like an example, and whether you like him politically or don't like him
That's
politically,
fine.
let's just take John McCain. And
Okay.
listening to his story of spending 5.5 years in a POW camp, regardless of where you feel about him politically, that's a story, that's a good archetype, because it's a story of sacrifice, and it's a story of like, I'm going to be the last person to leave this place. Like, he had many opportunities, because he was like the son of a general or something. He was he was given many offers to leave early, and he decided to stay behind. That's an example. That's an archetype where the stakes are real. Like, you're spending 5.5 years, good years of your life, darn it, stuck in a POW camp, and you're staying behind. And then he was tortured so badly he could never even raise his arms, beyond like a certain level. And I'm like, that's the kind of stuff that we should be valuing once more. We shouldn't necessarily be valuing like the rich celebrity or the person who's like, hey man, like check out how many views or whatever I got on Instagram and so forth. And that's the kind of pivot that we need to start making, because those people, we value them because the things that they achieved came at great cost and came at great sacrifice.
So you're fighting a bunch of forces here at the end of the day, because popularity is going to be one of them,
Yeah.
and kids, and some of it's just maturity, right? Like it just takes time, and sometimes the unfortunate reality is people have to act out a bad belief before they get to a good belief. That's the hard part. And so like, how do you transition your role models? How does this, like, what's the right thing that you need to do to add meaning to your life? Like, what's your why, for example? Or what's your, and the why just isn't, it can't just be limited to something that you can achieve quickly or something like that. It has to be everlasting, almost. So you're always aiming for it. It's like a perfect type of thing you're aiming for.
So, no, I think that you're right. And this does require us to kind of sit and think deeply. But if we were to have, I actually have a friend out there who's a nurse, and I think that like our modern day, like at least in this year, right, of 2020, is if we think of like the first responders, our doctors and nurses, who every single day, even though they had, a protective equipment and so forth, every single day they expose themselves to like a harmful disease. And it's so easy to kind of like see the intrinsic value in that. Like this person is saving lives, and every single day they are exposing their own bodily well-being to danger. Let's turn the camera on them. Let's highlight more of these stories. Let's make more documentaries. Let's make more films that kind of show a surgeon who spent like 3 weeks working nonstop. Like there are nurses and doctors that I know, Jim, that have worked like 20-hour shifts, and they fall asleep for 4 hours and then they get right back to work. And I'm like, we could easily be making more culture and more films. And that, I think that, like, I honestly believe we are good people. And I honestly think that if Hollywood made movies like that, we would start watching them. Like, they would be so irresistible to us because we would intrinsically know that these films embody like the best of humanity.
Yes, I would agree with you. I think that those stories would be helpful. The thing with that though is, and this is some things that I would struggle with, is the ideas. It can't be overly political. You have to remove. In some ways, you can have like a political allegory type talking point within the story, maybe, but you have to remove it completely.
I agree with
Um,
that, because if people think, oh, wait a minute, I'm being fed here an agenda or something, then people put their guard up and they get suspicious. But if the story is just about like a random nurse and a random doctor, and again, I think stories that are even based on true stories even sell a little bit better, because it's like it's not just some fiction writer making stuff up. It's based on something that actually happened. And I think that if you do that, and I agree with you, you remove the politics out of it, and it's just like, this is the story of a doctor who was working for 3 months during COVID or something. Well, now you've created a role model from the ground up. It's kind of like the Tom Hanks, what was the film where he lands the plane? Like that guy in the
Sully.
yeah, Sully, right?
Yeah,
It's like
something like that.
we've done this before. We've done this before where we've taken regular folk and we've kind of made them into like that. Like that Sully is like the archetype of pilots out there. Like, so we know how to do this. It's just a question of willpower. It's just the willpower to start making more of these stories come true.
Fun fact: there's also this shadow version of Sully that was made. If you want to put, because it's like, I think it was like, maybe it was Denzel Washington that was drunk and
Yes.
somehow managed to land a plane, right? So like, that's the kind of the shadow anti-hero version of that. But it's still interesting. Yeah, we can do videos like that, and movies and shows, and highlight those types of people. Um, it's a slow, arduous process. And what I would like to kind of point to is the Vietnam War, right? Soldiers coming home from the Vietnam War were called baby killers, all other fun stuff. Very rarely do you see that happening now. It's almost completely changed. Like, thank you for your service type of stuff. And it's a little different in that regard. So it's a long game.
Yeah, it is. It is a long game, and I think the first step in winning this game is for us to just be honest with ourselves, because I think there's a part of us that just says it's harmless entertainment. It's not really having a negative impact. But I think that the data is starting to come out. I was reading a book recently about we have more young unemployed men than ever before. We have females attending college in a 6-to-4 ratio as compared to men. Like, this stuff is having a negative impact on society, because I think that enmeshed in all of these video games, your Grand Theft Autos, your Tony Sopranos, your all of these things is a bit of like cynicism coupled with nihilism, in that it basically tells you, hey man, your life isn't worth all that much. It's really not. Just sit back, relax, take a seat on the couch, open up a beer and chill. And I think that for the Greeks at least, I think that their archetypes served as a call for action. They served as a call to action of like, here's how I want my life to look like. Here's what glory looks like. Here's what valor looks like. And we don't have to become the Spartans, okay? We don't have to like adapt like the most vicious warlike persona humanly possible. But I think that we can start creating new archetypes that give our story value and give it kind of glory. And again, it doesn't have to be glory necessarily through war. There's so many other ways that we can find that glory.
I would say we already are doing that. We're already creating a lot of these archetypes. I mean, like seriously, like let's look at America's founding. That's an archetype in and of itself. It's a great story with multiple different types of people involved. That there's plenty on it. The Civil War, there's plenty on it. Are some of our literature and our literary figures also. The question I would pose is it's not that we should take an overt approach to creating more. I think we already have them. They're just like it's literally just needs to like wipe the dust off. And that's all that's required. But how do you wipe the dust off?
Okay, I think I can. I think you're right. Listen, my friend, you are right. And here's how I propose that we do this. I think that you first need to create media that sparks intrigue, right? And it's like if you create movies that maybe somewhat have a semblance to the Odyssey, or you have movies that have a resemblance to this historical figure in history, and you use modern day characters, but there's like throwbacks, and there's like even like for example, there's in the third Batman movie, there's kind of a scene that really resembles the storming of the Bastille, and it's like you can kind of enmesh all of these things in modern day media, and then you build curiosity for these older things by sort of like hiding them into newer things, and that requires us to like first look back at the past and see, okay, what do we want to cherish from the past, and what do we want to discard, and that's a fair thing to do. So you're taking what you like about the past, figures like Abraham Lincoln, like you just described, taking those those characteristics, and you could reinvent Abraham Lincoln, or you could sort of embody something that Abraham Lincoln stood for in a modern context. And now you're getting the young people to interact with that modern medium, and then that's building the value system that's creating that curiosity, so that they'll then have like the tolerance or the threshold or the understanding to kind of dust off some of these older works.
Yes, I can see that working in a lot of different ways. And I mean, to me, I just don't think it's that overt, even that overt. And the reason why is because like we do this all the time. Like let's look at John Favreau, what he's doing. Literally, Star Wars is being pulled by the small Mandalorian train, right? Great story, right?
Yeah.
After the sequel trilogy, which was, I mean, debatably garbage.
Yes.
Like the Mandalorian tells a great story. It's a bounty hunter. It's a Western. That's actually uniquely American.
Yeah, right. It is.
And it takes it and it does exactly what you're doing. And it's just telling a good story.
Yes. And that's what I think. I knew we were going to get to Star Wars, and I'm happy that we're here now.
Finally.
Yeah. Right. Your baby Yoda in the background is smiling. I can see that. So thinking of Star Wars is that I think that the original trilogy was so successful because it harkens back to those archetypes from the past. That's what the original trilogy was basically riddled with all of those like those ideas, ancient concepts between good and evil, dating all the way back to Zoroastrianism, the code of Bushido from the samurais being reflected in the ways that the Jedi's thought. Even in the prequel trilogy, there's a lot of Buddhism that is kind of enmeshed with the ways of the Jedi. And I think all of that stuff is super duper positive, because a kid could see how the Jedis live and be like, hey, I admire Jedis. I want to be a Jedi. And then that kind of opens up the door to reading about the Code of Bushido. It opens up the door to reading about Zen Buddhist practices and so forth. And I think one of the reasons that we hate the new Star Wars trilogy is because all of those connections were completely severed. All of them were completely severed. Any kind of mentioning of archetypes or ancient religions just completely eliminated to a more commercially viable product.
I'm going to disagree with you. I think that this way, I'm just going to disagree for fun a little bit. So the reason why Star Wars is so important is the 70s was actually a period of malaise. 70s was like really not a good time. American society in general was kind of, we were in a malaise. We weren't really sure of ourselves. The 60s didn't work.
Nixon. No, it's like a lot of bad stuff. Yeah, right.
You know, the closing, the Vietnam War, so on and so forth. And so it represented the times, I think, very well, and it came out on the light side of things, right? Like
Right.
I guess on the objectively good side, maybe. The new Skywalker stuff, the Rise of Skywalker and the sequel trilogy, I think is also indicative of our time in a way that is, in my personal opinion, just not good. Not and it's not just because they don't, harken back. I mean, the whole first Force Awakens was literally just a recycle of A New Hope anyway. It just did something to it that didn't seem to fit the times, and it backfired because it felt too manufactured, too J.J. Abrams. Explosions doesn't make a movie. It doesn't
No, it
make
doesn't.
a story. A good story may have explosions in it, but it doesn't necessarily, like, I mean, I can watch several movies that don't have a single explosion in it. Like, for example, A River Runs Through It.
Mm-hmm.
It's about like 1930s, 40s. He's a young guy growing up in the country, going fishing with his dad. It's a great story, actually. I don't need the explosions.
Yeah.
And if you think your audience needs explosion, pause, explosion, you want a good story. You don't need to tell me everything. And I would be very careful with discarding of the past. This is actually a question I get asked a lot about the Bible and stuff like that. So like a lot of people will say like, oh, you just need the New Testament. No, you don't. You need the Old Testament. You need all the atrocities in the Old Testament in order to understand why the New Testament is so important. So just kind of I would keep that in mind, is be very careful what you discard, because yes, we may not agree with it, but it is a very helpful arrow pointing to what we can't see.
When I say discard, these things, I'm not necessarily literally meaning like, let's get our red pen ready right now. But what I'm saying is that when we are at least creating these new works of art or these new mediums, if they're sort of like highlighting some of the best from this canon of literature, it's at least getting that curiosity sparked, so that someone will go back and read the New Testament or read the Old Testament, or at least, and then, like, as I said, I think everything starts from something, right? And you have to start somewhere. And I always argue that if you're going to start somewhere, start with the best, or when I say best, I'm not trying to put value on it, but just the most easily accessible and the most easily understood, right? Like, so you want to take the concepts that are easily understood, that can very quickly be like transmitted into positive action and positive behavior. You embed that stuff into the new media, and then later on you might explore these canons. You might read up on Zen Buddhism and get all the nuances and get all the details, and you might read up on the Code of Bushido and get all the details, and you might figure out, well, hey man, I kind of don't like the way the samurais handled that. And okay, that's for the individual. I'm not saying we should hide that, but that's sort of something for the individual to kind of make up their mind about.
There's a lot of things you have to be careful with, because even then, like, you think, let's put ourselves in the perspective of Kathleen Kennedy and the sequel trilogy, right?
Yeah,
The
right.
sequel trilogy, like, they thought they were doing all the right things, right? But it turned out it wasn't. And the reason, and again, I think this kind of goes back to this idea that the story was manufactured. It
Hmm.
wasn't. It wasn't as a genuine story. It was. It had like. And what does it mean to be a genuine story? Well, you have to create things in this world that are consistent, right? I mean, we can't like. I think everyone looked at the three movies and were like, this is completely inconsistent upon first inspection. I mean, there's some surprises. Yes, you want to have some surprises, but you don't want to have to like bend over backwards to find that consistency sometimes. Like, and that's where I think like really good stories offer some of the best role models, and I would say pathways to individuation better than like a manufactured story. Like Tolkien is one of them, right? So like Tolkien wrote not just the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit, but he also wrote the Silmarillion and the Lost Tales and a slew of things. And one of his goals was to have a story that was coherent and that had
Hmm.
mystery in it. He intentionally didn't tell us what happened with the Entwives. Like we don't know what happened with all the Entwives. Like we will never know because he's dead. Chris Tolkien wants to make something up because he wants to ruin it. Um, but at the end of the day, like the story was consistent, and also knowing when to stop.
Hmm.
When is enough enough? I don't need 9 Halo games. I just
Yes.
need 3. If you can't, I mean, 3 is I think a good area. Just do 3. Star Wars 3. Write some books, have some fan stuff. Legends is great. Star Wars is like it's great, but like there's a time to stop. Like when we don't need to have Star Wars cinematic universe or the Marvel cinematic universe the way it is. We just need good stories that offer different pathways to individuation, like curiosity, opposites, wizard, king, failure.
There's a lot of commercial value and sometimes conjuring up, as you said, manufactured stories. And I think that anytime I sound like the ultimate idealist now. I'm like, hey, Mr. Disney, hey, Mr. Hollywood, money's not the most important thing, but here goes. It's like it's not the most important thing if those stories are becoming diluted, if they're becoming manufactured, if they're losing original essence, and there are no decent role models. If there's no decent role models in that story, I think we need to. The studio is always going to want to make money, right? The studio is always going to want to make a profit. Okay, fair enough. But we as the viewers can kind of vote with our dollars and be like, hey,
Absolutely.
this story is redundant. Hey, this story doesn't have, archetypical figures that I relate to or I'm learning or I'm growing for. So I think we have a lot of power in the stories that we choose to endorse and the stories that we choose to kind of throw by the wayside. Jim, thank you so much for being on the show
Yeah.
today.
Oh, no problem. No problem. Thank you for having me. Hopefully we can do this again sometime.
Absolutely, my friend. This concludes the 103rd episode of the Truth Island podcast. I'm Aaron Azrod.